All right, today we're introducing you to a new benefit of using Dazuki, which is courses. I'm your host, Lucas Bishop, the manager of product marketing here at Dazuki, and with me today is Brian Sully, who has a ton of experience helping companies integrate Dazuki and is also our head of sales. Thanks for joining me today, Brian.
Yeah, Lucas, thanks for having me. I'm excited to show off what we've been working on for a while now and really looking forward to showing, how courses could benefit, potential customers and our current customers.
Good deal. And in the same vein as other well-known features in Dazuki like guides and answers, courses is built to support workers. And the key features being the automation of your training program and the ability to easily track who in your workforce is trained.
Yeah, and those are two really key points there. And the other point I would make that's a little bit less tangible is, courses was designed to make continuous improvement sustainable. And what I mean by that is we often see companies that are working really hard, spending a lot of time to improve processes. But then when they do make those updates and they improve the process, they don't communicate them very well to the frontline workers, so the operators. And so the operators never implement the improvements and the company doesn't gain the benefits that come with continuous improvement.
All right, so today we're going to run you through some of the benefits of courses, some of the ways it can work for you, and what it actually looks like in a live demo.
Yeah, and along the way, I'll jump in. I'm going to share some of the insights. We've been working with some customers early on when we started developing courses. They joined our beta program, and so we've got a lot of interesting experience and insights that we'll be sharing during this walkthrough.
Great, so let's start by discussing some of the problems that courses is solving. First one's job shadowing, one of the most common ways that we're seeing workers train today.
Yeah, and one of the things with job shadowing, it's so common. I think we probably talk with a few thousand manufacturers every year, and 90% of them are using job shadowing. And one of the main reasons why is it's easy and it's somewhat effective, but there's a lot of problems with it, and especially in manufacturing where you have high turnover. Oftentimes you're going to bring in a new employee, they're going to go stand next to an experienced employee and learn how to do their job. But when you have a high turnover workforce, that experienced employee, they might only have 3 or 4 months on the job. So they really don't have that much experience, and they're probably not really capable of training a new employee. But the other challenge with job shadowing is it usually doesn't involve training a new employee to the standards. So you as a company may have come up with a standard way of doing that process. But once you say, hey, Steve, you've been here 4 months, train this new employee. Now Steve's going to train that new employee on how he does the process and all the habits and shortcuts that Steve's picked up over time. And that's just not consistent, and you're not going to have a consistent quality, consistent product if everybody's doing the process a little bit differently.
So we commonly see companies who've built out documented standards, but they aren't actually using them for training.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting one. We've been doing this for over 8 years now, almost 9. And it's been really common for us to see manufacturers spend a lot of time creating these work instructions, and then they don't actually use them for training. They're merely used for meeting compliance. And this leads to challenges like we talked about with job shadowing, where you've got somebody who's been there a while. Employees, rather than looking at the work instructions or referring to them, they'll go ask an experienced employee. And they're probably going to share information with them that might not be accurate and probably isn't actually the standard that the company developed.
And then, more often today, managers and other staff, they need to make decisions based on who is trained, and visibility into the competency of workers is critical in that process.
It is, and I would say this is actually becoming one of the top questions that when we talk to plant managers, we talk to trainers, supervisors, people like that, they want to know, who on my team has been trained to do this process. And one of the reasons they're asking that question is, manufacturing, just like they have high turnover, someone leaves the company, I need someone to fill in. Who's capable of running this particular piece of equipment? Who's been trained on it? High absenteeism is another thing. Joe's out for the day for whatever reason. I need somebody else to fill in for him and run this particular piece of equipment. I need to be able to answer that question really quickly so we can keep production running.
Good deal. And then, just like with work instructions, we often see companies trying to use Excel for things it's not really equipped for, like tracking the training status of every employee on a factory floor.
Again, very similar. We talked about job shadowing. We talked about work instructions not being used for training. Another common occurrence in manufacturing are these Excel-based training matrices, and they do work well. If you just want to track training one time, I think they work really well for that. But they're impossible to keep up to date. And if you have more than one person responsible for keeping it up to date, what you often end up with is different versions, and then no one knows which copy is the master copy.
Yeah, and then tracking of employees' training status becomes even more critical when you're going through an ISO audit or an FDA inspection.
Yeah, and we hear this all the time. I mentioned we had a beta program for courses that we opened up to some of our customers that have been with us for a long time, and we had one manufacturer who was telling us a story how the ISO auditor came in, asked one of their operators, how do you know how to do this process? And the operator said, well, I've been trained on it. And then the next question the ISO auditor had for him was, well, where's the training record at? And one of the really neat things with the Zuki, one of the engineers was able to pull up the training dashboard in Zuki and show that the operator was actually trained to the latest version of a work instruction. So just like that, he was able to answer that question. And I think one of the key things there is once they showed the ISO auditor that training report very quickly on an iPad, the ISO auditor didn't ask for any more evidence of training for the rest of the employees. So just by answering that question once and quickly being able to show that report, that killed the rest of those training questions.
Nice. Dodging the minefield.
Yep.
So then, what types of companies is courses best suited for? It's a good question here. And then what we're seeing is, it's really for any company that uses documented standards.
That's correct. Yeah, I think, number one, we're a software company and we are using courses to train our employees. So I don't think it's limited just to manufacturing. It could be, useful for a variety of industries, but we really built this with food and beverage, aerospace, oil and gas, automotive, with those industries in mind. But again, anybody who's got training that they need to track and they really want to automate the tracking and the assignment of training, courses is going to be a good fit for them.
Nice. So next, let's get into a bit more detail on really what courses is, what it consists of. In the simplest terms, courses is a training management system. And as with most parts of Dazuki, we've taken something complex, in this case, training management, and simplified it. And with courses, we're simplifying the management of training your workforce. And that, when we speak of training, is comprised of procedures, curriculum, assignments, and auditing. So let's briefly discuss each of these. So the very base component of our training modules are procedures, and a procedure can be any documented standard, like an SOP, a changeover, work instructions, lockout, tagout procedures, preventative maintenance. If you're already familiar with Dazuki, procedures are managed with guides. And here's an example of, what one of our guides looks like. All right, so here we have an example of a Dazuki guide. You can see this is a lockout, tagout procedure. As far as the version controls, this is version 6, and it was approved by Brian Sully of the training group back in November. 11 steps, takes about 5 minutes to complete. And if a operator completes this guide, they've effectively locked out and tagged out a machine. And as with any training, a trainee is tested against a curriculum. So within Dazuki, your curriculum's built around your documented procedures. Here's an example of the curriculum within one of our training modules. I showed you a guide that was on the lockout tagout procedure. And here you can see the guide included as one part of the curriculum in safety training. So the safety training actually is composed of 2 guides making up the curriculum. So who gets trained on what? And different types of trainings need to be assigned to different types of users for different reasons. As an example, an onboarding training may only occur one time, whereas an SOP training may be triggered when a standard procedure is revised, or a lockout tagout procedure training may need to be done every month for safety purposes. We help automate all of this. Here's an example of where the assignment of training modules would be managed. So when it comes to assigning the curriculum to a user, in this example, we're back on our safety training. It has two guides, a lockout tagout procedure and a new employee safety orientation. But you may only want the new employees to go through orientation one time, whereas the lockout tagout would be something that recurs every time there's a major change. So with the new employer orientation, we can set it so that it only recurs one time. They complete this, never have to do it again. Whereas a lockout tagout, we can set this so that every time there's a new release or a major release, the user has to go back through it. And again, all of these can be managed independently of each other, so you can add a variety of guides and trigger their assignment on different criteria. So who is trained? What are they trained on? Are they trained to the latest standard? Having a quick, accurate visibility into these questions is crucial. If you've ever tried to manage or even view a training matrix or a skill matrix in a spreadsheet, you know it can be very complex, and we've simplified this significantly. So within Dazuki, here's what it looks like to have visibility into the management of a course. Previously, we were looking at some safety trainings. Here we've set up something a little bit more specific, the Station 1 operator training for the LT3X70 assembly line. And we've assigned two different teams to take this training, the operators and the supervisors. And you can get to this level of detail a variety of different ways. Here we've kind of just assigned the course to these two different groups. And because of that, all of these users have been tasked with going through the training. You can see how far each user has gotten through it. So you can see Carl is 100% complete with every guide under the curriculum, whereas, for example, Stefan hasn't completed some of these trainings. You can get down to the team level, individual level, etc. pretty quick. Now let's get into some common use cases. A new employee is hired.
Yeah, you bring in that new employee and you want them to be trained on, set of policies and procedures is something we commonly see. You've got safety training, even software applications. If they're going to be clocking into Kronos, how do they use Kronos? If they're going to be using the ERP system, how do they use the ERP system? With Dazuki, you can create, procedures for all of those, or guides is what we like to call them, and create a course, assign that course, but then you can also set a deadline for that. So they have to complete it within a certain period of time, which is really important with new employees.
And then you may have a type of employee who rotates through different roles on the floor, or maybe even rotates through facilities. One week they're operating a packaging machine, next week they're working in production.
Yeah, and this one's really common, and this is where you talk about the Excel training matrix just not being able to keep up. If I've got Lucas and 1 week he's going to work for us on line 1, and then next week we're going to switch him over to line 2, well, he's got to be trained on 2 completely different sets of training there. And so I need to be able to quickly move him from one role to the other and adjust the training that's assigned to him. And so that's something that we've built into Dazuki, make it really easy to do through some functionality that we call teams. And teams are really just it's a user group is the way I would describe it. So you can create a team for a role, like a line 1 operator, could be for a facility, could be for an experience level or something like that. But it makes it really easy to automate the assignment, and I guess the word for it would be de-assignment of training.
All right, and then in order to gain the benefits of continuous improvement, your team has to be retrained when a procedure is updated.
Yeah, and this one's really, really challenging, I think, for a lot of companies. Is you've got manufacturing engineers, process engineers spending a lot of time updating procedures, and they go to put that update into place, and how do they do it? I think oftentimes it's done verbally. So the supervisor gets that information communicated to them, and then they're going to go tell the operators. And what we've seen is that's just not really effective. Especially it's almost like the game of telephone. Once that process engineer communicates the updates to the supervisor, and then the supervisor communicates to the operators, the message has changed. So what we've done in Dazuki is we've made a way for the system to re-trigger or to trigger retraining. So if a new version of a procedure comes out and the employee is assigned that procedure as part of their training curriculum, they'll have to be retrained on it, whether it's them walking through the training on their own or it's a training observation, or even, we actually have a quiz that you can build into these procedures as well.
Good deal. And you really don't want to think of training as a one and done exercise. Refreshers and updates are generally best practices, especially with the complexities facing today's modern workers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we see is this tends to be pretty compliance driven, whether it's OSHA or some sort of safety regulations specific to an industry. But you have certain procedures that employees have to be retrained on, every 6 months, every 12 months. So within Dazuki, what we've done is we've created recurrence intervals that could be set for each stage in your curriculum. And for us, a stage is essentially a procedure. So you can get really granular with which ones need to recur.
All right, and then deadlines-based trainings we see most often when a customer has like an upcoming audit, or maybe they're rolling out new equipment or a change in process is approaching.
Yeah, and this is a really, I think, a really beneficial feature. I've seen the benefit for companies that are bringing new people in, and they want to assign kind of some standard training to that employee. Like I mentioned it earlier, some of the safety or policies and procedures, things like that. They want to assign that training, but they also want to set the expectation that that training needs to be completed within a certain amount of time, 2 weeks, a month, or whatever. So within Dazuki, you could set that deadline. And as they approach that deadline, they're going to get notified that the deadline is coming. And their team owner or their supervisor will also get notified that that deadline is approaching. They'll get notified when the deadline has passed as well.
All right, and then it's becoming, more common that workers need to be trained across disciplines, even if they don't actively perform in those other roles.
Yes, cross training. I think this is really becoming something that manufacturers are focused on. They're trying to create a dynamic workforce. When you have high turnover, you have absenteeism. If you could have some star players on your team that can fill in and do a bunch of different roles, that's going to help the company out tremendously. Because again, bring up that point where if you've got somebody who's out for the day and they're running a critical piece of equipment, if you're down, for a limited amount of time trying to find somebody to fill in, that's lost production, that's lost money. So being able to cross-train people very easily. And the way we think of cross-training, Lucas might work on line one, like I mentioned that example earlier. And then we might say, well, Lucas, you'd be a lot more valuable to the company. And we probably wouldn't say it in that way, but, Lucas, one way to, potentially be more valuable is if you could also operate this piece of equipment and this piece of equipment. And let's say Lucas is really motivated to be more dynamic like that. We could assign him additional training courses in Dazuki, and he could complete some of that training on his own. And again, Lucas become more valuable, more dynamic, and be able to fill in different roles.
All right, so in any event, that was a brief rundown of the fundamentals of courses. And our goal with courses is to provide a flexible tool you can manage your training program with, and I hope this has given you a clearer understanding of that. Next, we're going to get into an actual demo of how the user interface for a few different use cases actually looks.
We're going to walk through a couple different examples in Dazuki. First one we're going to cover is what we call a read and agree. So a great example of this is you've got a policy, you want your employees to read it and review it, and then just acknowledge that they read and reviewed it. So if I go up to courses and I go to my courses, this is where all the courses that have been assigned to me are going to be displayed. And you can see I've got a collection of courses here. Most of them have expired for me. This is my demo account, but you can see here I do have some that I've completed, some that are in progress, but most of these have either expired or a new version of a procedure has been published within one of the courses. But let me pull up a standard read and agree example. So safety training is a good example I have in here. If I go to resume, I've got this new employee safety orientation that I need to complete. And I click Start Guide. And what I need to do is just go through this and review the information. And so in this case, we've got a PDF that's been embedded in the guide. As you can see here, it's a long PDF. So it's the safety orientation for our company handsaw. And then as I scroll down, you'll notice there's a little box here at the end that says end of course. And all I need to do is check that box and click mark as complete. So I'm saying as the employee, I acknowledge and agree to the information outlined in this guide. I mark it as complete. And then if I go back up to my courses and I go back to that safety training, it's now going to show that I just completed it. So very simple. Again, we see a lot of companies using the read and agree for policies, procedures, any type of training where you don't need to do a training observation, things that are typical training they could do on their own. The next example I'm going to walk through, this would be a self-paced training. So a situation where you want the employee to go through the information, you want them to understand it, but you also want to make sure that they really are paying attention. So maybe you're going to ask them questions and you're going to review the responses that they ask. So this lockout tagout is a really great example of that. I don't think you want to train someone to a lockout tagout and just have them acknowledge that they reviewed it. You might want to be a little more thorough and ask them some questions to evaluate their understanding or their competency of that particular process. So I click Start Guide, and you'll notice what's different this time is instead of taking me to the format where all the steps are on a single page, it takes us to what we call our operator view. So this view is typically used for either training like we're using it for here, or it's used for production for capturing data. So the employee would just enter in their name. And it looks like we've got unique work order fields activated on this site, but that's why it's not letting me continue on, but I just put in a different value, so it'll let me continue on now. And what we have here is the procedure over here on the left, and then on the right-hand side, we've got our digital form. So this is where I can ask the employee a question, and then they could choose the right answer. So lockout tagout procedure number doesn't need to match the machine ID. We know that's false, and we continue on. So the employee is able to go through this at their own pace. They've got the information that they need to answer these questions over on the left, and then they just need to select the best answer. And I'm going to speed through this example to get to the end. And now we're at the end, and you can see down here at the bottom, there's a team sign-off required. So you don't have to put this in there. This is completely optional, but this might be one way that you want to have a supervisor or someone verify the responses. So they selected all these answers. You need to have someone go through, verify that they are the correct answers, or verify that they, at least answered a certain number or a certain percentage of the questions correctly. But then Carl or Joe can sign off on this. So Carl could be here with me in person and sign off on it, or he could be at his desk and sign off on it. So Carl will get notified within Dazuki, and he has a page within his profile where he could go ahead and view that sign-off request. And I'm actually going to switch over to that browser here just to show you an example of that. So if I go to my example site here, I go to my profile, any of my pending sign-offs like what we've requested from Carl or Joe is going to show up here. So this is a pending sign-off for Carl. He submitted this a bit ago, last month. I can review his responses and then enter my password to sign off. And now that'll indicate that Carl has been trained on this, and I have approved his training. So he's marked as competent. So I'm going to sign off on behalf of Carl since I know Carl's password. And then if we exit out of here and we go back to my courses and we go back to that training course, you can see now that training course is gone. I am now fully competent on safety training level 1. So those are two examples. One is a on your own read and agree. The other one is on your own with questions and almost basically a quiz plus a sign off built into it. The final example I want to walk through is a training observation. And this was really great. Earlier in the webinar, we talked about job shadowing and, why we think it's important for companies to move away from job shadowing. So if you're not using job shadowing, how are you going to train employees? And one of the ways that we've seen some of our more successful customers do this is they use a method where they walk the employee through the training. So they walk them through the procedure in Dazuki. Then they demonstrate how to do the procedure themselves. So the trainer will actually demonstrate how to do it. And then the final step in the training process is to have the employee do it on their own with the trainer evaluating how well they do it. So it's again, that's why it's called a training observation. You're actually going to observe the employee doing the process. So I'm going to pull up an example I have here. And actually it's in my other course here. Let's see. There it is. It's the how to set up and use the roll form machine. So I'm going to click Start Guide. And then imagine that I've got my trainer right here with me, and I'm going through and I'm doing this process, and they're evaluating me. And what's key here is, this is how it gets away from the job shadowing is you've actually got an observation. Someone is actually watching the employee do the training or do the process and evaluating them, but they're actually evaluating them in a standardized way. So if you have multiple supervisors, multiple trainers that are, doing this training evaluation, they're all going to ask the same question. Did the trainee locate the correct template? Yes. Was the trainee able to make adjustments? Yes or no? So standardized questions to evaluate the competency of employee. It's really key, especially for larger companies when you have a lot of folks that are going to be doing these training observations. And the rest of this procedure here is pretty much the same. And what I'm going to do is get to the end here. And just like I showed earlier, there's going to be a sign off. I have the ability to assess the competency or the accuracy of the work the employee did. And then I can sign off either in person or in remote or remotely, just like I showed with the example for Carl. So we click approve, and now that completes the training for that particular course. So that was it. That was a read and agree, self-paced training with questions, and then a training observation.